This conference will now be recorded.
All right, welcome everybody. My name is Janus Boye. It's a pleasure, honor to welcome Preston So for this CMS Experts conversation on the key social contracts. Over to you, Preston.
Thanks, Janus. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today, and thanks all for joining. Hope everyone's staying safe and healthy today, and obviously dealing with this time the best as we can. My name is Preston So. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'll introduce myself in just a little bit. But just as a note, this is about a presentation about essentially how we're moving from this realm of web content management over into digital experience platforms and revisiting some of these social contracts that CMSs have signed with their users over the course of the past few decades and how they've kind of shaped up. For those of you who attended my session last year about grand new compromise in content management, this is a bit of a spiritual sequel to that presentation and a bit of a check-in about that session. One of the things about today is that I'm not really going to be presenting, let's say, a whole lot of solutions or a whole lot of ideas, just presenting some of the issues that we should all be thinking about as product managers and as product owners at our respective companies. I also want to share briefly a little bit about some of the upcoming plans that we have at Oracle, and to tease that a little bit in terms of what's going to happen later this summer, later this fall from our end. So without further ado, let me just go ahead and very quickly introduce myself. So for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Preston So. My website is preston.so. You can go ahead and check out some of my writing there. I'm a product architect and strategist. I'm also a futurist in digital experiences. And you also might know me from my book, Decoupled Drupal in Practice, which is considered the authoritative Bible on how to build headless Drupal sites and headless Drupal applications. I'm well known in the fields of headless CMS, as well as in content management systems in general. I've spoken on the subject several times at South by Southwest. And I'm also editor-in-chief at Tag One Consulting, one of the best-known Drupal consultancies. And I've also led product teams, design teams, engineering and innovation teams at various organizations like Acquia, the Drupal company, Time Inc., and Gatsby.js. As some of you already know, I wrote a book called Decoupled Drupal in Practice. For those of you who are interested in how headless Drupal works, how some of the older legacy CMSs are doing headless these days, Decoupled Drupal in Practice is still in print. It's still on sale. Published it about 3 years ago, and it's selling very, very well still. So it's got a foreword from, of course, the Drupal project lead. So everything you need to know about headless Drupal. By the way, one thing that I haven't revealed to the larger public yet, and one thing I'm going to go ahead and announce to this group is that I've actually got 2 books coming out later this year. One of them has a working title of Voice Content, which is essentially about content strategy and content management from the perspective of voice interfaces and how to actually really enable really powerful and robust voice-driven content experiences. The second book I'm also going to be publishing later this year is going to be called Gatsby, the Definitive Guide. And it is the developer's guide, comprehensive guide to Gatsby.js and Jamstack with the Gatsby framework. So for those of you who are excited about Jamstack, static sites, look for Gatsby, the Definitive Guide, coming from me later this year from O'Reilly. And that'll be coming hopefully later this year as well. Also, I run a conference in New York City called Decoupled Days. From July 14th to 15th this year, we're going to be doing a virtual conference once again with Decoupled Days. We're in our 5th year. This is going to be our 5th year running a really successful conference. And this is, by the way, the only nonprofit, volunteer-run, entirely community-led headless CMS conference. We operate in a very, very different model from a lot of the other headless CMS conferences and Jamstack conferences that you've seen out there. We're very focused on giving back to the community, and our sponsorships are running out. So for those of you who are interested in sponsoring, our conference is going to be July 14th through 15th, and we've already run out, unfortunately, of our top tier sponsorships at the presenting and diamond tier. So we still have gold, silver, and bronze sponsorships available for those of you who want to reach a really great headless CMS audience. We tend to attract a very diverse audience, given the fact that we don't have any corporate connection and we're a nonprofit open source conference. All of our content is in the public domain. Please consider sponsoring us this year. So here's what we're going to talk about today. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to kind of level set a little bit with all of you. Some of you have probably seen my last presentation from last year about what I consider to be a really strong need for the new grand compromise in CMS. Obviously, just a few weeks or months ago, we just got the new Gartner Magic Quadrant for digital experience platforms. And I want to talk a little bit about how it is that the new idea of DXP and these new concepts behind digital experience platform, all of this kind of DXP talk is really papering over a lot of the early social contracts and a lot of the problems that those early social contracts present from the context of what we originally had in web content management. The two social contracts I especially want to cover today are digital experience management from the standpoint of actually really managing those from a low code or no code perspective, from the standpoint of editors and marketers, not from developers, and also from the standpoint of no code content preview. So one of my requests of the entire group today in the audience is, I know all of you work very often with developers with a variety of different personas. I want all of us to take off our developer experience hats. I want all of us to take off our hats that deal with the developer persona. And let's focus today just on those no code or low code personas that interact with the CMS in ways that sometimes get laid by the wayside a little bit. And what I mean by that is all of the folks who are not developers, the content strategists, the content managers, the content planners, the compliance officers, the project managers, the product managers, those who are actually working with the content on a day-to-day basis. And then I want to talk a little bit about why it is that this idea of digital experience management and this idea of DXP in a lot of ways is actually a misnomer that papers over a lot of issues in terms of what we have today. A lot of this you'll also be seeing in some of my upcoming writing for CMS Wire as well. I want to end also with some of the kind of discussion that I've been having with a lot of other folks and that has been really prevalent across the headless CMS and traditional CMS space about some of these black box issues that come out in DXP and how we can begin to solve some of those. But first, before we dig into the new grand compromise in CMS and some of the things that we covered last time, I briefly want to define what exactly a social contract is. When it comes to a social contract, we all live in a social contract. Whether we live in Denmark or we live in the UK or we live in Canada, all of us has a social contract with some other entity. When it comes to us as citizenry of our respective countries, we have signed an implicit social contract at birth, right? And that social contract is, I will pay taxes to my government. I will live under the laws of my government. I will be willing to participate in my government as long as that government gives me certain rights and freedoms, and as long as that government gives me certain protections. These kinds of social contracts have been in place in our societies for millennia upon millennia. If you think about the Magna Carta, for example, or some of the earliest social contracts that were signed in the times of Babylon or in the times of Rome, these social contracts are extremely important to the functioning of society. And believe it or not, we also have, sorry, I hear noise, maybe someone's not on mute. These social contracts are things that are extremely important to not only the functioning of our societies and the functioning of our governments and the functioning of our civic lives, but also the functioning of our CMSs and the functioning of the ways in which we serve our customers. Last time, one of the things I mentioned was that marketers and content editors want more control over non-web experiences. And we dug into a little bit about what exactly this means from the standpoint of these personas in particular. We have a very clear idea of what this means from the developer perspective. But from the marketer or content editor perspective, largely what they mean by they want control over non-web experiences is they want the same level of control that they had over websites and multi-site governance to be restored to that same level of power in non-web experiences. And we spoke last time about how there's a very, very big incongruity in content management today, a very big problem that unfortunately has been taking many, many years to solve. There is not really one clear solution yet for this problem. But of course, the problem is that when it comes to some of the WYSIWYG capabilities or some of the no code or low code preview capabilities that our editors and content marketers have today, they're only limited to responsive websites for the most part. Maybe some mobile apps that are driven by frameworks like Cordova, but certainly not driving things like preview of Roku apps or preview of WebXR-driven apps or preview of LAR platform apps or preview of voice apps or some of these things that are very important to marketers, but are simply not at the level that they need to be, at the same level that they were with websites and with responsive behavior back in the day. And as we can see today, one of the biggest problems with this channel explosion is that the infrastructures are multifaceted, the infrastructures are complicated, the infrastructures are very different. When it comes to developers who want to work with CI/CD pipelines that are extremely tightly intertwined with the various technologies that they want to work with, becomes a very, very big problem for CMS vendors. Because now we have to figure out how to serve all of these different infrastructures that are still relevant to our digital experiences and are still relevant to our marketing teams, but are now much more complicated than the original ideas that we set in stone. Still to this day, even today, even 4 years after I first presented this slide, it's still the case that all of these sorts of things are still largely the domain of developers, even when it comes to something as basic as preview. How do you preview your content in a dialog flow chatbot? How do you preview your content in an Angular-driven digital sign, like the Angular-driven signs that are used on the MTA, which is our New York City public transit system? How do you drive preview of content that is supposed to be displayed in Layar, which is a SaaS platform for augmented reality experiences? How do you drive preview of Samsung TV or Roku apps? These are all things that we are increasingly facing over these last few years, and we will continue to face over these next few years. And so far, the answer has been a hodgepodge of a variety of different solutions. But this is the thing that I think we've forgotten, and a lot of developers have been involved in headless CMSs too little time to really understand, which is that the CMS has always been built on this uneasy alliance between personas. And as we said last year, there was a grand compromise that was forged. There was a social contract that was signed between these various personas that basically said, we will give you all sorts of control as long as we retain certain features that democratize these digital experiences for us and not just for the developers in our midst. But of course, one thing that we see from the headless CMS, from Jamstack, from a lot of these new developer innovations, and this is not in any way meant to impugn any of these innovations. They are incredible innovations and they are important innovations to the developer experience when it comes to building digital experiences. But this means that not all CMS personas are created equal anymore. Because when it comes to us moving over to the Jamstack or moving over to some of these headless CMS infrastructures, where does that leave the editor? Where does that leave the content marketer? And this is the fundamental problem that faces every single one of us as vendors as we move from this idea of WCM, especially us legacy vendors, right, who have started out with this idea of creating multiple sites arbitrarily on a single CMS. And now we have to move into this paradigm where Gartner and Forrester are asking for not just websites, but any manner of digital experiences that are non-web experiences. 4 years ago, I showed this graph. And by the way, this graph has proven to be very popular. I saw Adam Sturrock, who's the new VP of product marketing at Amplience, use this as well. 4 years ago, I put together this graph, which is basically saying what's better for the end user ultimately at the end of the day is something that's great for all of the different personas that have to interact with each other in order to yield this user experience. And this is a conversation that I know Mark and Dean and I have had extensively in the past about how we can no longer think about some of these personas as being in their own isolated worlds. They are very much part and parcel to the experience overall of the end user in these CMSs. So we talked about this move from WCM to DXP last time and why it is that this whole notion of site building and this whole notion of visual building, it might be dead, sure, but that doesn't mean that every single aspect of how content marketers and content editors interact with our websites and digital experiences have to be dead as well. As I mentioned last time, the holy grail of digital experience management is not necessarily WYSIWYG digital experience management, because for all intents and purposes, that era has kind of passed. We can't really drive front page or Dreamweaver-like solutions for a situation where we have different kinds of infrastructures and different kinds of frameworks and different kinds of technology, regardless of how much anyone wants to say that JavaScript is the future of how everything will be built. But what we really need is not so much digital experience management like WYSIWYG. What we need more is digital experience presentation management. How exactly can we make the developer experience still be compelling for those developers while avoiding those pitfalls of things like a single page app editor, which might create a huge amount of vendor lock-in and a huge amount of problems for those developers down the road? But also, how do we make that exact same compelling experience that the developers have available to the marketing teams and the content teams? So just to recap from last time, the challenge is how to ensure that both of these different teams are satisfied. And how do we help in these situations where these marketers feel left behind, as well as developers? Our goal is to figure out how do we figure out that new nexus, that new central point where we know that both marketers and developers will be happy. So to do this, we have to look at a bit of history. And I did this last time with all of us as well. But you might think, well, there weren't really social contracts back in the day of WCM. But in reality, there very much were. When you think about that first transition away from some of those early CMSs like Expression Engine and Movable Type over to some of these newer CMSs like Adobe Experience Management, back then CQ5, right? Sitecore, as well as Drupal and WordPress. The first early social contract that all of those users signed with their vendors was digital experience management. What do I mean by that, though? What I mean by that is this first decision that a lot of us vendors had to make was, should we enable single site or multi-site management, right? Should we allow ourselves to become a platform or just become the system that is tied to a single website? Now, one of the really nice advantages of that time was that because websites were the only digital experiences at that time, this idea of shared infrastructure, shared technology made this a very easy proposition, right? Adobe Experience Manager, it's the same architecture. So you just create a new Adobe site on that same exact infrastructure. Drupal multi-site, the same exact thing. If you want to create a new Drupal site, just create it on the same exact technology, the same exact infrastructure. But obviously, one of the problems is that today it's not that simple. And traditional WCM only dealt with this one single question, which is, should we be single site or multi-site? Obviously, today, we have a much different set of calculations to make. Consider, for example, and let's take off, once again, our developer hat and focus just on the non-developer personas here. The second early social contract that we forged at that time as well was this idea of no-code content preview, right? If I can go in and create any arbitrary digital experience, which in this case is a website, I should be able to also, without having to write any code or set up any complicated pipelines or do anything that's really complex, be able to see a content preview of that content without writing any code. And traditional WCM, right, basically only had to deal with this one question, which was, okay, so how should we enable that, right? Should it be revision-based? Should it be based on some other mechanism? Should we have snapshots? Should we have things like a time machine kind of functionality that allowed us to look at different snapshots over the course of time? And traditional WCM only had to deal with some of these really limited questions. They didn't necessarily have to deal with some of the issues around deployment and some of the issues around infrastructure that today a lot of our platforms and vendors deal with now. Of course, with new digital experiences, with new channels emerging, this social contract expired. And developers very quickly knew that this social contract expired. But marketers and content editors and content planners and content managers are not aware of this social contract having expired. Let me give you one example. On a regular basis, I hear from prospects and customers, not just at Oracle, but across the entire enterprise CMS market and of course down market as well. And the most common question I hear is, it used to be so easy. Why is it so much harder now? Why can't I just create a mobile app or a voice app or an AR/VR app or a chatbot app or a digital sign or a smartwatch app or a Roku app just as easily as I was able to create a website back in those days? Why is it so much harder now? And if you think about this from the content editor or from the marketer perspective, from that CMO perspective, you get it, right? Because the marketer, the content editor, the content planner, the CMO doesn't care at all about the fact that this is a totally different architecture. This is a totally different infrastructure. This is a totally different CI/CD pipeline. This is a totally different deployment mechanism. They don't care. They don't care. So for vendors, we have to solve this, even though it's a matter of client education as well. Yes, it is harder, and that's a fact. But our customers, by and large, really don't care very much. They expect us to solve that problem for them. And data needs to end up in more than just those websites, and previews need to be done in more than just websites. So when it comes to digital experience management, one of the problems that we have today, of course, is that we now have a lot of our data rendered elsewhere. But the bigger issue is that a lot of our new channel explosion, the new channels that we're seeing in the channel explosion are things that are not easily managed in our old paradigms of managing digital experiences. No longer are we talking about shared infrastructure. No longer are we talking about shared deployment mechanisms. No longer are we talking about things that operate or function or are architected in the same way. And if you think about this once again from the content marketer or from the CMO perspective, what they're used to is this idea of simply being able to click add site or add experience and having that digital experience show up right there alongside the other digital experiences they have to manage. The experience they're looking for today is something that's very similar. And I hear this all the time from out in the field. It's that it shouldn't matter that my React site is driven by Node.js, that my Gatsby site is built on the Jamstack. It shouldn't matter that I'm using React Native for my mobile apps, or that I'm using native iOS code for my mobile apps. It shouldn't matter that I'm using Dialogflow, or that I'm using Oracle Digital Assistant for my chatbots. What every marketer wants to be able to do is something like this, where you can add any one of these arbitrary digital experiences, just like you were able to add websites back in the day on Adobe Experience Manager, or on Drupal, or on what other CMS you might have, or DXP you might have. For some CMSs, obviously, they weren't architected this way originally, and this is where headless CMSs have really come and kind of overturned this paradigm. But as you can see here, one of the biggest sources of complexity for us as vendors, if we want to go down this path of enabling this sort of ability to create arbitrary digital experiences, just like the social contract we signed back in the day with our customers allowed them to do, is this crucial piece down here. What happens when us as DXP vendors no longer have to deal with a single piece of infrastructure, but now have to interact with a variety of different kinds of infrastructure that we might not have any understanding of deeper than simply knowing that it's hosted on a particular server or a particular architecture? And this is one of the key problems that we have to solve, whether it's through client education, which is what a lot of the headless CMS vendors are doing today, or whether it's through enabling a much deeper form of digital experience management that really gets at the core of why we enabled that add site button kind of functionality in the first place. Why was it that we originally put that kind of functionality in there? Why was it that we allowed for people to arbitrarily create these things without writing a single line of code? It was because we wanted to democratize this for all of the different users that need to be able to interact with our various architectures. So this whole question of why is it so hard now is a problem of being besieged from all these different angles, right? At the end of the day, product managers and people who are responsible for the marketing teams and the marketing outlays, they want to have more digital experiences. But the content strategists, the content marketers, the editors, they want to have more of that visibility into those experiences, something that they're not getting today and they're not able to have nearly to the same extent that they had to have that they had before. But of course, the third thing, and what I would call the black swan in all of this, is that developers continue to want freedom to build, and they will continue to innovate. And this means that we're constantly playing catch up. Developers are going to do what developers are going to do. So for many years, it was all about just adding some site templates and a theme, adding a site, and voila, it was good to go. But now we have to make a lot of different decisions and a lot of different hard choices about how our new paradigm is going to work. A lot of the headless CMSs have made their choice already. They've said, we're not going to go into this path of individually managing these digital experiences, even though a lot of other CMSs signed that social contract back in the day when they first enabled multi-site governance. But as these infrastructures begin to diversify, one of the things that is very, very worrying about this is that we're never going to get to a point where infrastructures have another big crunch. Right now, we're in the midst of a big bang of infrastructures, and there's never going to be a point where we're going to go back to having one single shared infrastructure for all of these different things. And that's just a fact of the way that the channel explosion has changed the way that our infrastructures operate over the past few years. No-code content preview is exactly the same problem, where web content management back in the day made a promise. And sadly today, a lot of prospects and customers still have this idea in their head that no matter how you build your digital experience, there will always be some way to preview that content before it goes live. And this kind of preview is one of those features that has led to a lot of innovation, but also a lot of frustration among those of us who are customers of these headless CMS vendors, as well as traditional CMS vendors. Preview is hard. Preview is hard. Getting preview to work in Contentful is hard. Getting preview to work in any other CMS in a headless fashion is hard. But that doesn't mean that our customers don't want that. Once again, if we look at the way that content management previews used to work back in the day, it was just a matter of looking at a site that's managed in that content management system and viewing that in the context of multi-site governance and previewing it in the same way. Why wouldn't we want to enable something like this for preview as well? No-code headless preview is one of those features that is possibly the most commonly requested feature that I hear from the market today in terms of headless CMS. And it's one of those requirements that really hasn't gotten that bulletproof solution yet. And it frustrates a lot of different customers because either we're providing a hodgepodge of integrations with various infrastructure providers that really are very, very brittle and tend to break very often, or some other ecosystems have provided plugin buttons that basically inject a preview button, once again, that also points to that separate infrastructure and provides that preview to that user. Others have provided single page app editors or SPA editors that are very custom built and are very, very robust, but also guarantee vendor lock-in. It's very hard to move off of those kinds of editors. So here's the question, right? Are marketing teams destined to lose out? Or are they going to have some of these features that they signed these social contracts for finally be built successfully for this new world that we live in? Or are they forever going to be relegated to this situation where they're never going to have any access to something that for all intents and purposes is a black box? And this is where I want to end today before I turn to questions, is that when digital experiences are no longer tangible, viewable, browsable, manipulable, manageable entities by personas that are not just the developer, right? When I as a marketer, when I as a content editor cannot touch and see and feel and view and manipulate and actually interact with my digital experience that I am ostensibly supposed to manage, they become black boxes. And they become things that, for me, don't really matter. And they only matter to developers who are able to have power over them. And when these digital experiences can no longer be interacted with as richly as they were before, this is what happens to the marketing teams. This is what happens to all of those marketing personas who see this little preview button on the side or see this separate infrastructure, see this separate way of doing things as a loss of power and not as something that they're benefiting from. When editors can no longer interact with these digital experiences as tangible entities, as things that they can physically interact with and see, that's when they're becoming convinced that they're playing a losing game. So the DXP cannot and must not lose sight of this legacy and this social contract that it has signed over the course of decades as a multi-persona enabler and, more crucially, in and of itself, a multi-persona democratizer. Thanks very much. If you want to get in touch with me, preston.so@oracle.com. I'm also on Twitter @PrestonSo. And once again, if you want to sponsor our conference, Decoupled Days, please get in touch as our sponsorships are selling out. And look for my books. Decoupled Drupal in Practice is still on the shelves. Also, you'll see voice content from A Book Apart, and also Gatsby, the Definitive Guide from O'Reilly coming out later this year. And I'll go ahead and turn to questions.
Thank you, Preston.
So I see one question here from Mads already, Mads Jørgensen, which is, yeah, when the marketer misses out on some of the things they are used to having, do we then replace them with other advantages? Reuse of content, channel-specific authoring, one place that hosts everything. Yeah, Mads, this is a great question. So I'll address each of these one by one. Reuse of content, channel-specific authoring, one place to host everything. Reuse of content is already something that I think marketers understand, right? When it comes to content reuse, back in the day, the earliest CMSs have always been good at saying, hey, you can reuse your content anywhere you want to on the website, right? As a teaser, as a card, as a link, as a preview, like a tile in a table. So content reuse isn't something that's necessarily, new to this audience. What's new is content reuse across different channels. And that's the thing that I think a lot of content marketers very much understand, very much are on board with. But one of the things that they're not so on board with is this idea of channel-specific authoring. So I deal with a lot of content strategists and a lot of content planners on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things that a lot of these content strategists really complain about is this idea of having channel-specific authoring, where you're potentially having disparate versions of content, right? Where you have one version of content for web, one version of content for voice, one version of content for chatbot, one version of content for something else for mobile. What happens is that actually goes against the whole idea of omni-channel content, right? Because the whole goal of omni-channel content is to keep everything in one single source of truth. is to keep everything in one single rendition, so you no longer have these different versions of content that get out of hand. The solution that I've actually stated is a much better idea, and this is actually something I mentioned in my upcoming book, Voice Content for a Book Apart, is the fact that channel-specific authoring should be algorithmically driven, right? You should never have to have a content strategist create a completely independent version of content that's voice-specific, because now what you've done is you've created a potentially orphaned or siloed version of content. In reality, that sort of thing should be automated, right? So if we have a piece of web content that needs to be converted to a voice format for a voice interface, let's let machine learning take care of that, right? Let's let an AI bot go in there, convert that content automatically into a voice or spoken piece of content, so that our editors only have to manage one piece of content. Because once you start getting into channel-specific authoring, now you're talking about having the editors who are already short-staffed, who are already looking for ways to reduce the amount of burden they have. Now they have to go into 3 or 4 or 5 different places to edit the same content, which makes absolutely no sense.
But isn't there some leeway between this? Because you also have things like inheritance that can go on between channels. So simple inheritance models can help you adjust to different outputs and stuff like that. That is not necessarily AI, but just inheritance. I mean, so there's more sides to it, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, absolutely, Mads. And once again, I'm not saying this is one size fits all, but content strategists, right, generally are very wary of this idea of channel-specific authoring, and I think for good reason. But absolutely, your inheritance point is very, very valid too. It's a hard problem. It's a hard problem. As far as hosting in one place, I absolutely agree as well. So.
All right, Preston, I think it's time to say thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Great content, very good feedback on the chat as well. Thank you once again for taking the time, for sharing your insights, and let's do it again for the big announcements later in the year. I certainly look forward to staying in touch, and we'll share these slides and the recording. And as Preston said, please feel free to keep the conversation going. Thank you, Preston.
Yes, thanks all, and more to come later this year. Thank you.
Thank you.